No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main, Part 13, Domesticating the Savage Brotherhood. The buccaneer, who in an awful sort of way most fascinated John Esquemeling, the buccaneer storyteller, chronicler, and fable weaver, was Francis l'Olonais, a Frenchman from Les Sables d'Olonne, or the Sands of Olonne, in Brittany. L'Olonais had spent part of his youth as an indentured servant in some unspecified place that Esquemeling designates only as the Caribbee Islands. No record survives of how he performed that role, but if youth is father to the man, he must have been the surliest churl ever to plow a field. He was nevertheless a compelling leader. Once he won his freedom and joined the buccaneers on Tortuga, he advanced from crewman to captain only after 2 or 3 expeditions against the Spaniards. He was not only a man of ambitions, but a man of large ambitions, the first, by Esquemeling's reckoning, to advance from raids on shipping to a large-scale assault on a major mainland city. He set his sights on Maracaibo, a town of some 4,000 inhabitants and the pearling center of Venezuela. Setting out from Tortuga with no fewer than 660 men, he led a fleet of 8 ships, and naturally l'Olonais sailed in the biggest one, a vessel mounting 10 guns. Luck was with the buccaneers from the start. Off Puerto Rico, l'Olonais and his men intercepted a 16-gun ship bound for Mexico with 40,000 pieces of 8, and chestfuls of jewels worth again as much. Proceeding southwest past the Isle of Savona, he scored again, capturing an 8-gun ship bound for Hispaniola with a hold full of muskets, 7,000 pounds of powder, and 12,000 pieces of 8 meant to pay the Spanish Hispaniolan garrison. L'Olonais had already won a reputation for atrocity by lopping off the heads of the prisoners he took, or feeding them the raw flesh of mules, and starving to death those who could not stomach such fare. Now he sailed leisurely south across the Caribbean. After a 3-hour attack on the Venezuelan fortress of De la Barra, l'Olonais allowed just enough survivors to escape to spread panic everywhere. By the time he reached the outer defenses of Maracaibo, the Spaniards were sending frenzied rumors ahead with exaggerated accounts of the host about to descend. As Esquemeling narrated the story, a band of terrified soldiers ran pell-mell into the city howling, "The pirates will presently be here with 2,000 men and more." The citizens of Maracaibo fled with the soldiers. L'Olonais took possession of the city, seized a haul of wood and wine, pursued the refugees into the forest, where they yielded up another 20,000 pieces of 8, and a train of mules laden with household goods. Thinking that so rich a town should have greater wealth than that, and that the inhabitants had probably hidden their treasure at Gibraltar, the next port up the coast, l'Olonais marched his men in that direction. There the buccaneers found the Spaniards ready to fight. A battery of 8 guns was mounted above the town. But by feinting retreat, l'Olonais drew the unwary Spaniards away from their own defenses and then suddenly turned back and slashed through them, killing 200 and taking another 150 prisoners. By the time the buccaneers entered Gibraltar, most of its inhabitants had fled into the woods. While his men stormed through the town, looting the monastery and the houses, l'Olonais sent an emissary to the fugitives in the woods, demanding a ransom of 10,000 pieces of 8, and threatening to burn down the town if he did not get it. The citizens hesitated. L'Olonais started burning at once. Frantically, the citizens pleaded with him to put the fire out, and came up with the demanded ransom. With the money securely stowed in his ship's hold, l'Olonais turned back to Maracaibo, and, under the threat of punishing the town with more of the same, extorted another 30,000 pieces of 8 from those unhappy citizens. His objective now won, l'Olonais decided to bring his expedition to a close. After an 8-day passage, he put in at a secluded anchorage at Hispaniola. There he and his men unloaded the ships. When the treasure was all amassed, each man repeated the oath that every buccaneer took on setting out, that he was concealing nothing from his fellows. Then they counted up their haul. Between the ransoms, the looting, and some more ship's prizes that Esquemeling must have forgotten to detail, they found that they had a total of 260,000 pieces of 8, quantities of silks and linen worth another 100,000, and a quantity of silver plate with no recorded value. After dividing the loot, they made their way back to Tortuga. There, wrote Esquemeling, they made shift to lose and spend the riches they had got in much less time than they were purchased by robbing. The taverns, according to the custom of pirates, got the greatest part thereof, insomuch that soon after they were constrained to seek more by the same unlawful means they had obtained the preceding. So Lolones was off again, this time on an expedition to Puerto Caballo, a silver-rich depot along the Nicaraguan coast. With a fleet of 6 ships and 700 men this time, he made a passage across the Caribbean without incident. At Puerto Caballo, he roared through the town, seizing the contents of its 2 warehouses and sacking the citizens' homes. When several Spanish householders refused to divulge the whereabouts of their troves, Lolones pulled out their tongues as an object lesson to the other reluctant residents. Escamilling does not recount the size of the buccaneer's haul this time, but Lolones appears to have found it satisfactory, for he left the town standing. Pushing his luck, he decided to move inland, presumably to get closer to some silver mines, and so set out for the village of San Pedro. But that village could not be reached without a treacherous overland march, and on the way Lolones committed an infamous atrocity for which he is remembered with horror. Stumbling on an ambush, he eventually overran the position and learned from his captives that the Spaniards had stationed similar ambushes all along the route to the city. Lolones ordered the prisoners to show him another way to get there. They protested that there was none. Off the beaten path, the woods were impassable. At that, Lolones went into such a fit of rage that he seized a prisoner and with his cutlass cut open the hapless man's chest, pulled out the still beating heart with his hands, and bit into it with his teeth, snarling, "I will serve you all alike if you do not show me another way." He then stuffed the heart into another prisoner's mouth. Quivering with fright, the prisoners took Lolones into the woods, only to have him find himself that they were right. As he turned back, he swore an oath that the Spaniards would pay for this inconvenience. But fortune at last forsook the buccaneers. At the mouth of the river Nicaragua, Lolones and his men encountered a mob of Darien Indians, an untamable tribe that the Spaniards had learned to dread. Well they might. The Indians fell upon the 700 men, and only a few buccaneers escaped. Most were killed. They were the lucky ones. A number were captured, including Lolones. The Indians roasted all alive save Lolones, on whom they had a special design. Seizing the buccaneer leader by his extremities, they tore him to pieces while he uttered blood-curdling screams. They then threw his body limb by limb into a fire and flung his ashes to the winds. Writes Escamilling, to the intent no trace nor memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature. And thus ended the history of the life and miserable death of that infernal wretch. In Escamilling's account, the buccaneers, whether in small groups or in great concentrations, were entirely independent, bowing to no government and no laws except their own. But in the 1660s, though the chronicler does not write of it, great changes were in the wind. By then, the buccaneers had been bedeviling the Spaniards for 30 years and more, with only occasional notice from the governments of Europe, which were otherwise preoccupied with concerns closer to home. However, now a new generation of rulers had come to power, ready to claim the territories that their smuggler settlers had overrun. None was more eager to do so than the King of France, the dashing and elegant Louis XIV. King in name since the age of 5, Louis assumed power in his own right in 1661 at the age of 23. Among the innovations he fostered was the French West India Company, a syndicate of merchants backed by royal funds and royal authority, whose mission it was to secure French trading rights in the New World. In 1665, the company dispatched one Bertrand de Ogeron, a captain who had already been trading all over the Spanish Main for perhaps a quarter of a century, to oversee the interests of France in Hispaniola, where the French-led buccaneers were virtually in control of the entire west end of the island. De Ogeron was hard put to fulfill his mission. The buccaneers were scattered along the coasts of the island of Hispaniola in inaccessible places, surrounded by mountains or great rocks of the sea, by which alone they can pass from place to place in their little boats, he wrote to his government. Also writing, they live like savages, without recognizing anyone's authority and without any one chief, and they commit 1,000 atrocities. Clearly, it would take a certain imagination to assume command of these unruly fellows, but de Ogeron was the man for the job. One day, according to a tale told not by Escamilling but by some anonymous observer, de Ogeron was seized with inspiration. Word escaped that he had exclaimed to a friend, "I shall order chains from France for these rascals." The word spread throughout the island that de Ogeron was planning something drastic, but what could he possibly have in mind? Several months went by before they had their answer. At length, a ship arrived at Tortugas harbor, and the astonished eyes of a quay full of buccaneers drawn there out of curiosity, there came mincing and swaying down the gangplank 150 harlots plucked from the streets of Paris, where they had been given then choice of jail or Tortuga. "Hey there, who wants a wife?" cried de Ogeron as the women sallied into their all-male preserve. "What will you bid for these fine ladies?" Before long, the entire cargo had been bought. Nothing could better have symbolized the subtle changes that were stealing over the Spanish Main. Plundering and smuggling still had a long and happy life ahead, but the buccaneers themselves were beginning to be domesticated. Wives and inevitably children heralded the approach of yet another generation. It was one that would have vested interests in the land, and a royal representative meant that a certain percentage of the profits of trade by any name would eventually head back to the crown that could keep a rein on its own subjects. All through the 1660s and the next decades, the French consolidated their control over the western half of Hispaniola, calling the colony Saint Domingue and bringing in thousands of immigrants with their slaves to plant tobacco and sugar. The colony grew in relative peace until 1690, when France found herself at war with the rest of Europe, and the French governor led some 1,000 buccaneers and colonial militia to sack and burn the Spanish settlement at Santiago de los Caballeros, in the north-central part of the island. Later that year, the Spaniards retaliated by invading and destroying the French town of Cap Frassat on the north coast, thereby setting off a series of raids and counter-raids that would inflame the island for almost a decade. France was only one nation whose subjects were among the interlopers on the Main. In the 3 decades since the 1630s, the number of northern Europeans on the Main had risen from 18,000 to an estimated 100,000, and they occupied an estimated 2,500 square miles of supposedly Spanish territory. Most numerous were the English, 50,000 strong, who had spread far and wide through the Lesser Antilles into the Bahamas, and whose presence on another of the buccaneers' haunts, the nearby island of Jamaica, was causing tremors that were to be felt throughout the Spanish Main.